Brigg Reilley. He's a volunteer and now a staff member from Doctors Without Borders. He's been with them for about 6 years. He's been all over the world, Africa, Asia, different parts of Europe, Russia, basically handling large-scale epidemics and disease and illness. And his background is an epidemiologist. So, Brigg, could you tell us basically what does an epidemiologist study?
Well, I'll study trends of disease. So I'll work on Doctors Without Borders projects around the world, and I'll try to follow how many people are getting ill, what are they getting ill from, can we define the case, and how many people are dying, and what decisions do we need to make based on that information.
I see. What is, could you give us a short, like 2-minute history of the cycle of an epidemic, or is there a word smaller than epidemic?
Well, there's all sorts of epidemics, but the main ones that Doctors Without Borders works with are infectious disease, usually. This is where the system isn't as well developed, there's maybe not as much infrastructure, and people are still much more vulnerable to infectious disease than they are in countries like the US.
Well, give me an example of one that occurred in, let's say, Africa or Sri Lanka or Asia. Just give me an example of one, the course of one of these.
Well, I think one of the deadliest that I know of was a cholera epidemic. And cholera you will get from impure water or food, and it can kill in a matter of hours in extreme situations of you'll die of dehydration. And in a refugee situation, it can really take off, where you've got very, very cramped quarters. End of 1996, there was a huge epidemic in the Rwanda-Zaire area, and that killed tens of thousands of people in a matter of weeks.
Tens of thousands?
Tens of thousands, apparently.
This was subsequent to the political unrest and the massacres?
This is basically a large group of civilians, hundreds of thousands of civilians fleeing an interethnic conflict.
So did that emigration precipitate the epidemic of cholera? Was that the cause of it, that the water supply became contaminated because the society was destabilized?
It's certainly a contributing cause. When you have a large population move, and again, there's no infrastructure, there's no running water. So these are all things, breakdown of infrastructure, either from war or from economic breakdown. So there are a lot of contributing causes. This is not the way it usually should be, and these are the emergencies that Doctors Without Borders will go to.
Well, what were you able to do in that case?
Unfortunately, very little. You could basically try to rehydrate as many patients as you can, but when you're dealing with something on that scale, you can save as many people as possible. You had a lot of parents who actually had to keep moving, so they would leave their child with some sort of identification and leave it to the doctor's care if it were dying, and hope to recover their child, somehow be reunited with it in the weeks to come. It was that desperate.
Were you able to institute or promote some larger systematic remedy for the situation, other than just dealing with the people who were afflicted? We were able to stop the epidemic or aid in stopping the epidemic?
Yeah, but it's basically getting clean water there as quickly as possible in huge, what we call bladder tanks. These are collapsible tanks that hold thousands of gallons of water. But again, cholera moves so quickly that we still don't know how many people we got there beforehand or how many people actually just survived the epidemic. But we just try to do what we can.
Okay, I wanted to ask you this other question because your experience is so vast. Do you find that these epidemics work the other way, that illness and epidemics and starvation destabilize a country?
I think it's a bit of a vicious circle. They'll definitely feed off the other, and you'll see that poverty will really exacerbate disease, and vice versa. If you have maybe a family that's poor, the breadwinner is much more likely to fall ill. If the breadwinner falls ill, the family is much more likely to slide even further into destitution. So certainly the two piggyback off each other quite efficiently, unfortunately.
And political instability, like civil wars or conflicts, how do they fit in? Do you find those usually coordinate with these kinds of problems?
Yeah, you'll have a few things going on there. You'll have a breakdown of infrastructure, and that ranges from everything from no more doctors being available, no more medical supplies, to again lack of clean water, poor housing, and poor nutrition. And all these things, you really don't have much chance of remaining healthy.
Isn't it adequate for the West to just address the problems of HIV/AIDS in the third world? Isn't that the main calamity that's going on?
As far as the diseases we're looking at, HIV/AIDS affects rich countries as well. So there's a lot of research into HIV, and the problem is it's not affordable. The drugs exist, but they're too expensive in a lot of countries that need them most. You've got millions of persons infected in many countries, Asia, Latin America, Africa, very heavily affected. And they can't afford the drugs. At $10,000 per person per year, it's simply not a question for them. There are ways, to reduce the price. There are ways to bring it down to a huge amount, up to 95%. You can get generic copies, generic drugs of high quality from countries like India or Brazil, and they reduce the price to about $250 per person per year. So a vast amount. It can really make a life-saving difference.
So, in other words, if there was an economic change in the countries regarding their patent rights and permissions to generate the drugs, they could produce it at a viable cost.
Right. Brazil took that step. They said, this is an emergency. We're going to make our own drugs. It's just too important. And they had a lot of trade pressure against them because these drugs are just like designer jeans or watches. And so they got a threat probably to say, well, we're going to tax your exports if you do this. And they stood by their decision, and they're able to treat other persons with HIV and AIDS.
Is a similar situation exist with other ailments, or is it just, in other words, you know, we in the West would consider that the majority of illnesses and plagues that have troubled the world are gone. Malaria,
right.
You know, the tsetse fly, it's gone. Smallpox, I mean, the only threat from smallpox is terrorism.
Right.
So most of these ailments are gone, aren't they?
Well, in fact, we're worse off against a lot of infectious diseases than we were 10 years ago. A lot of these illnesses affect mainly developing countries or tropical countries. It's tropical diseases, and there's been no research or development in them. So instead of cost being a barrier, there actually are plenty of pills and drugs out there. Many of them are affordable, but in fact they're useless because they were developed 40, 50, 60 years ago.
Well, why wouldn't they work now?
Well, over time, any drug will, well, let's say any germ will become resistant to the drug that we try to treat it with. That's already happened with HIV here in the U.S. It's a normal progression, and what has to happen is research has to stay ahead of the resistance patterns. So we need to keep coming out with new drugs and new drugs over time.
So the malaria, the quinine or whatever treatment is used for malaria has lost its potency against the current strain of malaria.
Well, the main drug given is one called chloroquine, and that's from the 1930s. Quinine is still effective, but it's very toxic. It's quite risky. There are some places that it is not as effective anymore, but it can cause things like deafness or coma, so it has to be really administered with a lot of care. It's a bit of a last resort drug.
But the other drug that was developed in the 30s is losing its potency?
Pretty much, it's pretty much like giving a sugar pill in a lot of countries. But it's still affordable, so a lot of countries have to give that. It's a bit of a placebo. And the problem is there's not much financial incentive to go into these drugs. If I'm president of a big drug company and you approach me and say, look, we have to do something about malaria, it kills 2 million persons a year, this is really a global priority, I'll say, well, I'm sorry, perhaps I sympathize, but I live and die by market rules. You know, my shareholders are most important, and as a result, I have got more incentive to find a new Viagra or a new antidepressant or a new wrinkle cream, one of these, let's say, lifestyle or designer drugs. So this year I'll probably find a 19th new pill to help me with my lactose intolerance, but nothing new towards malaria or tuberculosis or some of these big global killers.
Or, you know, Doan's, pills for the backache. You know, you got backache, you got to take Doan's pills.
I've got plenty of choices on back pills, but not much.
Well, how would you say, I mean, Doctors Without Borders, I know, is more aggressive in trying to find a social, political solution rather than just administering to the people who are afflicted. They try to change the infrastructure, you know, come up with the obvious solution and get it implemented. Well,
that's correct, because this situation doesn't have to be accepted as an inevitable, sort of this is the way the system works and too bad, because that's not the way it should be. There are solutions that have been proposed. Again, for HIV/AIDS, I mentioned the generic option. Some of these middle-income countries can bring the price down to where it's affordable for them. For research and development, there are quite some economists that have come up with ideas. We're not a think tank organization, we're a field-based organization. So we're not endorsing any specific solution, but there are 6 or 7 blueprints out there, and we're traveling the country with this exhibit.
What exhibit?
Well, it's an exhibit, it's housed in a 48-foot trailer, and in it basically you get you'll get a patient card, and here's a sample.
This would be hold that up so they get a shot.
This would be malaria up there. And this takes you to basically one of our case studies and one of our international projects. These are real people that have passed through our clinics that we haven't been able to treat effectively.
So in other words, you could take on the beingness of the person with the ailment.
Exactly.
So pick up a card, name your disease, take a card, pick a
You
card.
spin the wheel, you have no control. There's about 5 diseases and we match you up randomly with one of them. And that pairs you up with someone else who's had the same illness. And in the last room, basically what we'll have is we have field volunteers like myself who have returned from some of these projects overseas, and we'll give you a diagnosis and we'll tell you what we can or can't do for you. Unfortunately, it's usually what we can't do for you because these drugs are so outdated and no one's looking for new cures. But we will, it's not to induce guilt or pity, and we're not even fundraising, it's more talking about solutions, because solutions will come from civic activism and from a country like the US, which makes the vast majority of new drug compounds in the world. But right now we have our top scientists, a lot of them working on these lifestyle drugs. It's a bit, it's Shakespeare writing comic books, unfortunately, because that's where the money lies. Yeah.
That's good. Okay. So, do you think? So, what do you call this project? You know, I mean, what were you talking about? A van?
It's the Access Expo, and you can find the schedule. We're now in California, and in the first week of July, and then we're moving to Northern California and around the country. We're culminating in March 2003. At the White House, and we have a petition that's going to private industry as well as the government saying there are solutions out there and you need to work together and stop talking about it and actually do something.
So, a degree, this is more than a multimedia van. There's people there. There's a little bit of a show.
It's interactive, yeah.
It's an interactive.
You're encouraged to ask questions, find out why isn't there a cure for this? Why couldn't we prevent that? Because this situation has its roots in a lot of different areas.
And it's called the Access
Expo.
Access Expo,
right?
Which I can find out about on the internet.
You can find out at doctorswithoutborders.org. That's all one word. And there's a lot of information there about a lot of international projects. But on the far right, you'll see the expo schedule around the country. And I think even more importantly, you'll see the online petition. There's an online version, and you can sign that. It doesn't put you on a mailing list. You're not going to get any junk mail from us. And if you email that to friends, then I think it could have a huge impact. If we show up in Washington, D.C. with 500,000 signatures, it's going to be much more an impact than 5,000, let's say.
Okay. So now, so in other words, Doctors Without Borders is presuming the task of changing or putting some conscience into the pharmaceutical industry, the commercial pharmaceutical, and government.
It's a market failure because these people don't have money. That's why the companies aren't looking for new cures. But it's also a bit of a public policy failure. We think the government should provide incentives to get the private industry, which has all this expertise, back into what's important.
Well, the origins of Doctors Without Borders is France and Europe. What about Europe? I thought Germany had a lot of pharmaceutical manufacture.
Again, all of it is in pretty much private sector, and the private sector has the profit motive only, and so that's why they're not interested in malaria. But there, again, are solutions, because if I give an example, the drug industry really enjoys a lot of legislative benefits. Something will be produced from our tax dollars at a university, and it will provide a promising molecule or drug compound, and the drug company then will scale that up into something profitable, and they'll invest a lot of research and development into that. So they've derived quite some benefit from our tax dollars already. Then they get a patent, which gives them a 20-year monopoly on that drug. So all the profits they get go immediately back to them. So we're not against that per se, but I don't find it unreasonable to ask for something back. One example, one of these economic ideas, and again there are several, is if I go to buy my Viagra, some of that money goes back into tuberculosis research or malaria research, and it's subsidized a bit. Same with the tobacco tax here. You pay a bit extra for your cigarettes, that goes back into prevention efforts. I personally wouldn't have any problem with seeing something like that.
So those drugs or medicines or pharmaceuticals which are, let's say, not essential to existence, like some wrinkle remover or Viagra or weight loss, or
right.
But they're outside of they're more cosmetic.
Right,
or,
exactly.
Et cetera.
And
so it's like a luxury tax.
If you will, yeah. Again, that's just one possibility of several. And I mean, it gets to very much extremes. We had one illness. It's basically a parasite. It's from the tsetse fly that you mentioned. It's invariably fatal. It's 100% lethal without treatment. But the main drug that was useful for it, that was life-saving, went out of production because they weren't making enough money.
What's the name of the illness?
The illness is African trypanosomiasis, or it's called sleeping sickness, because you gradually lapse into a coma and die. The main drug for treatment went out of production.
What was that called?
It was called eflornithine, and we couldn't get it anymore. We are able to get it back in production, not because we were such strong lobbyists, although we tried very hard. It turned out to have a beneficial side effect. It was a facial hair remover. So because of that cosmetic effect, it went back into production because they were making a profit.
You're kidding me.
That's exactly right.
Because it was a facial hair remover, it became popular and therefore available to cure sleeping sickness.
Right. So now we're just getting it back into our projects. In the absence of that drug, we've had to use something from the 1950s. Again, it's not unusual if I talk about these illnesses. Tuberculosis, no new drug for 40 years. Main malaria drug is from the 1930s. The drug we had to use is called Melarsoprol. It's very painful injections because it's based in arsenic. So what it'll be very corrosive to your veins. It'll be a all over burning sensation, and in fact it kills 1 out of 20 patients. So not only would I say it's archaic, it's a bit of a medieval treatment, and again there's resistance to this treatment even. So it's old, it's outdated, and it's deadly, but often it's all we've got.
Wow. What's your viewpoint? You've traveled all over the world. What's your viewpoint on prevention or you know, the logistics of stopping the spread of an epidemic? Cut your losses, you know,
Right.
like isolate, stop people from interacting or traveling from village to village and so forth.
Right.
Methods like that.
Prevention definitely has a role. What happens is you reach a point of diminishing returns. If I talk about malaria or dengue, some of these other diseases, Chagas, a lot of them have an insect vector, we call it. The insect gives it from one person to the other. So quite some efforts have been made in Egypt, Latin America, all over the world. Say, well, let's kill this insect altogether and wipe it out, and
Cut
then
the
we're
vector.
fine, right? And that's a bit like trying to get all the rats out of, I think, the New York City subway. You have quite some initial gains, quite some initial successes, but after a while, it's getting harder and harder to really get that last 5 or 10%. And invariably, political will and the money starts to dry up, and then as soon as you pull back a foot, you've lost all the ground that it's taken you 10 years to gain. So that's been tried in very large projects over time, and that it has a role, but again, it's not going to solve the problem. You need the medical side as well.
But you need both sides.
Exactly.
Okay, so do you think that this is a topic for that, you know, I mean, do you think, I mean, you chose to do this. You got out of medical school and you chose to dedicate your life to these kind of activities. Do you think it's beneficial for people generally speaking in the medical profession to get involved with this kind of volunteer work? Oh,
certainly. I think a lot of people, when they first started medical school, I think this is exactly what they envisioned themselves doing. Unfortunately, it gets harder to stick to that, not through any fault of theirs, but they'll often graduate with a large student debt, or they'll have a family, a lot of things that make it impractical to go off and volunteer in a foreign country.
But I know the work you're doing is rather harrowing, and if the more people participated, there'd be more resources. It'd be a little bit easier.
I agree. Yeah, we could always use more persons. And besides this issue, there is information on volunteering on our website, both medical and non-medical.
What was that website again?
It's Doctors Without Borders. It's one word.
.org. Right. Yeah. I understand. So do you feel that the work has been rewarding for you? Is your scope and understanding of mankind and life has expanded?
I think it's put things in perspective for me. I think it's shown me the little things are just little things, and they're still important, but maybe not worth worrying so much about.
Don't sweat the little stuff, right? It doesn't matter if you're driving a Mercedes or a BMW. It's not that much of a difference.
Right. Yeah.
That's a joke.
I know. It's a good one for Southern California, too.
That's right. It's good for Southern California. Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to wrap up the show a little early here. I do want to tell you that you could take the time to go take a look at their website and send them some money, because I think it's better spent than going to see Spider-Man or eating some popcorn. And there's a lot of good restaurants in the west side of LA, but you can forego one meal and send that amount, $30, $40, $50, to doctorswithoutborders.org. I think they're doing something which brings a little bit more sanity to the world, a little bit better times for some people who are suffering. And it can hurt to help somebody.